In my previous video, I was talking about the super subtle dualistic split that can still remain after genuine awakening insights. And I was approaching this subject through the pointer or instruction resting in awareness, or resting as awareness, which is another version of it. And I didn't give much context for that pointing out. And I want to do it in this video. Because often we need certain fundamental insights, certain shifts to occur before we can approach this type of non-dual exploration without it being only intellectual or conceptual. So if we try to kind of jump directly from mind identification to the insight of no self, Anatta, and the realization of emptiness, that might be too big of a jump to make for most people. In some cases, that might spontaneously, suddenly, instantly just happen. But for most people, there seems to be a certain sequence of insights that kind of precede the shift to non-duality. And sometimes when I talk about non-duality, I point towards it in the direct experience. I tend to assume that certain shifts have already occurred, so I don't specifically mention that, because talking about these stages, it can easily sound kind of technical. It can also make it sound like this massive project for the seeker, this whole path. And I just like to keep things simple at times. But I can also see that it can be a little bit misleading to talk about certain aspects of deep realization without giving adequate context. Okay, so like someone was pointing out in the comments, this type of witnessing or observing awareness that is utterly neutral, disengaged, detached, that is simply observing phenomena, that is intimately present, but non-locatable, kind of impersonal. So that is very much how many people actually experience first awakening. And it's a totally valid awakening. It's a totally valid insight. And often when we approach first awakening, like intentionally orient towards it, it is advised to systematically disengage from all thought processes, and discover this pure immediacy, this cognizing presence that precedes any kind of narrative that we could tell about ourselves or tell about reality. So the first awakening is largely about waking up out from the conditioned mind into this natural sense of presence or beingness that is always there prior to telling any kind of story about it. And what is another aspect of first awakening, another crucial aspect of first awakening, is that while this disidentification happens, we see that what apparently holds it together is a belief in an actually existing separate self, like some sort of solid self in the middle of the experience, which is actually not there and never has been. So this sense of self is constructed by a kind of active process of selfing that makes it appear that there is something of an actually existing self. And that is what is being seen through, that self is actually just a mental construct. It's kind of like an image. And when that is seen through, there is tremendous openness, naturalness, uncontrived presence that becomes increasingly more available. So I don't want to go more into the first awakening or into these fundamental insights. In this video, I have done other videos about it, and you can check them out if you are interested about it. So what can happen after the first awakening is then a kind of deepening of this natural presence, of this immediate sense of I am, without any thought about it, into something that could be called the realization that everything is this presence. Meaning that this fundamental insight, it kind of spreads to all the senses. So in everything that I see, in everything that I hear, in everything that I touch, in everything that I taste, in everything that I smell, it is this presence, it is this consciousness. There is nothing but that. So the apparent exterior world or objective world is internalized in this phase of awakening journey, when we see that it's literally nothing other than what this consciousness is. And some traditions, they call it God, they call it divinity, and it very much feels like that. Experientially, it is quite impressive, quite impactful, this sense that the whole phenomenal world arises as nothing other than your own consciousness, which is seen to be God, which is seen to be divine, and that is what you are. That is what everything is, this fundamental one presence, consciousness, awareness. So I was talking about in my previous video about this type of background presence, awareness, sense of I am, and that is actually still very much present in this realization that everything is consciousness. So here, that subtle, immediate sense of presence, of beingness, is kind of expanded to its universal expression, that I am everything. And it's so immersive, that phase of the realization, and is quite spectacular. It often comes with energetics and bliss and joy and a lot of experiential byproducts. So it's very easy to miss that sense of a background awareness, that witnessing presence is still there, totally intact. But now it kind of embraces everything that is occurring as nothing other. So it's a kind of all-inclusive sense of self, as it is sometimes discussed, like self with a capital S. And in the comments, someone was bringing up this metaphor of fire and its power of illumination. Fire referring here to consciousness, and illumination, its power of expression, its power of manifestation, which is of course nothing other than the fire. So in that sense, consciousness is inseparable from the manifested phenomenological reality, which is an expression of its own power of illumination in this metaphor, which comes from Hindu tradition. However, even here, there is still that subtle dualistic split. And I know this makes no sense for someone who is in this phase of awakening process, of awakening journey. It's just something to be aware of, that this realization of I am, in whatever way it happens, it often feels very much like this is it. This is the ultimate thing. This is what all the traditions are talking about. And many people can get kind of stuck there for decades, for years, without even considering that there could be anything further. So there is many insights actually to follow from here. If you continue with this sequence of insights, if you are so inclined, if you have this inclination of liberation. And I think it's important to understand that going further with this process is not about any kind of hierarchy, is not about achieving some sort of higher forms of realization. Like, that's completely nonsensical. It doesn't make you more special. It's not better or worse. So going further is simply out of this innocent curiosity, like just looking in ever more honest and sincere manner to the experience, that is there still ways that I'm actually deluding myself? Are there still some fundamental illusions operating, some fundamental filters operating? Which there are very much in this experience that everything is consciousness. And I know it sounds kind of strange to say that, but that's just my experience. So when I had the first awakening shift happening, I was about 2 years immersed in that particular phase. Just that waking up out of the conditioned mind into this total unknowability and seeing through the self-construct and this incredible open, uncontrived presence being increasingly more available, like in a spontaneous manner. And then after 2 years, there happened a lot deeper shift, like a lot more visceral and energetic and complete. And first it launched me in this experience that I was just describing, that everything is consciousness. There is no physical world whatsoever. There is no objective world. Everything is this non-substantial, radiant, boundless, fluid, self-transforming, self-generating field of awareness, of presence. And it was absolutely beautiful. And for me, that lasted about 3 months, and then that collapsed or deconstructed into something that was then revealed to be something even more primary, something that I can only call like infinite nothingness, or some sort of absolute ground of being, kind of like silence and stillness and vastness beyond comprehension that underlies this dream of consciousness. So now that was seen to be a fundamental illusion, that sense of I am, even that universally expanded form of it. And what was seen to be the ultimate was kind of absence, non-existence, this unborn, undying presence that is not presence in any kind of way that is possible to describe in words. And Nisargadatta talks about this. Like, he talks a lot about the I am sense and abiding as the I am. But he also talks about that being only a foundational realization that will eventually go beyond itself to something that he was calling the absolute, or Parabrahman. I'll just read a little bit from Nisargadatta. So he says, the absolute is not this I am consciousness. So when the I am goes into oblivion, That is the eternal state. And one is in the supreme state without reason or cause, upon which consciousness spontaneously appears. So the one who is listening and is unknown is oneself as the absolute. The absolute has no experience of itself. In that state, there is no pleasure or pain. So he speaks a lot about this, especially in his last years just before dying. He has a book called Prior to Consciousness. So when I was immersed in this phase, for me it lasted at least a year. I had no idea what had hit me. It was just utterly incomprehensible. And at the same time, it was like a cosmic joke. And it took me quite a while to find any kind of context for what had happened for me. And then I eventually found Nisargadatta, and kind of kept me company during that phase of my process. And yeah, that's why I think it's worth talking about these phases, because we don't really know what happens. And I don't want to claim that there needs to be a specific sequence of stages, because that's not necessarily the case. Like, nobody really knows what's happening, but apparently there are these fundamental insights that can occur, and this is one of them. So if you find yourself suddenly plunged in this infinite nothingness, like this oceanic unknowability, like impenetrable void, within which the apparent manifestation, it just appears like a insignificant blip or some transparent, faint flickering that's barely even noticeable. Like, the emphasis goes so strongly to this fundamental absolute. We can't even say what it is. Like, there's not self-consciousness here in any way that we can really comprehend. And what happened for me was that at some point, this absolute state, and it's not a state, it's kind of like being in deep sleep, but eyes open. So it's the end of all states. So whatever it is, and it's still here, it's not something that can even be realized, strictly speaking. But whatever it is, it apparently collapsed back into the human experience, into the relative. And in that collapse, or implosion, as it felt like, they were both annihilated. That's just my way of putting it in words, but how it feels like that whatever this is, it's completely immanent and completely transcendent, and neither. So this subtle distinction that was still there, even in this deeply immersive and enigmatic experience of the absolute, that subtle distinction that was still there between relative and absolute, it completely collapsed. And then this pure non-duality that I was speaking about in my previous video, that started to reveal itself experientially. Because when we are given so much emphasis on the unmanifest, on the absolute, on nothingness, that's again another reification. So now, instead of reifying consciousness as the absolute reality, the universal I am consciousness, now the non-existence is reified as the fundamental reality. And the emptiness is given a massive importance And form is something of a secondary nature. It's something insignificant in comparison with this total absence. So when this collapse or re-entry into the humanness appears, as some people call it, then it is clearly seen that form is nothing other than emptiness. Form is exactly emptiness. Emptiness exactly form. So this idea of emptiness as some sort of primary reality that precedes form, that is dismantled here. That is deconstructed here. And then we can really, really look and see that there is only this, there is only appearance, only this apparent conventionality. And that is the absolute. So the absolute is equally dependent on the relative as the relative is dependent on the absolute. Is this interdependency that is realized here, which allows this experience of total interpenetration and interpermeation of the absolute and relative. Like this total dynamic functioning, which is then a never-ending unfolding and exploration and deepening with increasingly more access to naturalness and effortlessness and spontaneity. So when this collapse of this absolute state, this para-Brahman, when that collapses, it's kind of like all the grandeur of that realization disappears. But the radiance and the luminosity remains in this conventional reality, which is not what it appears to be, but also this idea of some sort of transcendental reality that is beyond it or underneath it. That's just not there anymore. So this is true groundlessness. This is true baselessness. And then we can see that in these previous phases, we were still constructing a new ground for ourselves from these non-dual insights, from these awakening insights, from various views. You know, like this experience that everything is consciousness, and now my experience is grounded on that. That's still another ground. And then that deconstructs into this infinite nothingness, this pure potentiality, and then that's the new ground. But when we see that pure potentiality, that nothingness, that's not actually there as some sort of, metaphysical substance, then this whole thing, this whole awakening process kind of collapses into just this, as some people call it. And it's characterized by utter ordinariness and just natural simplicity. And it feels so good. And it feels so, natural. So it's not like you miss that, that kind of grandiosity of para-Brahman or God consciousness or whatever we want to call those previous stages. It feels very liberating to release all holding, because there can be these subtle ways that we still fixate, even though the identity structure has dissolved here. So it may make no sense whatsoever. How could there still be subtle ways to fixate? But there is still this subtle tendency to try to reify, to try to fix, to try to solidify. It's just a habit here, so no one is doing it, obviously. It's just happening, and that habit is part of the perfection of it. So it just plays itself out like that. But when all holding is released, then this collapse will happen, that any kind of background collapses totally into the foreground, and then there is just the foreground, which is not a foreground anymore then, right? Because there is just that, there's just appearance. And no distinction whatsoever between appearance and awareness. It's just this seamless one taste. So there is this blog called Awakening to Reality, and some of this stuff is discussed there in quite detail. And some of it can be intellectual, but some of the pointers given there are quite brilliant. I'll just read a little passage. This is written by Tashness. So this is about the phase that is preceding, the realization of Anatta and pure non-duality. Emptiness looks like negation. Luminosity is mistaken as ground. Causality collapses into doubt. Okay, emptiness looks like negation. Yeah, exactly. So when there is this dissolution into nothingness, absence of existence, and we see that the I am experience, it was a fundamental illusion. So here, emptiness looks like negation. So there is still this step further to take into the realization of Anatta, no self, which is a negation, but I mean, it sounds like a negation, but it's not. It's actually quite affirmative. So yeah, but prior to that, emptiness looks like negation. Luminosity is mistaken as ground. Yeah, so this is what I was just speaking about earlier. So this sense of non-dual radiance, whether we associate it to one consciousness or pure potentiality, is mistaken as a ground. And this may make no sense whatsoever. It may sound just really abstract or conceptual, but it's a very powerful realization directly to shatter all ground when it just happens, when you see that it's truly baseless, this immediacy, this sense experience. Like in the seen, there's simply what is seen. In the cognized, there is simply what is cognized. Totally baseless. Okay, causality collapses into doubt. So this I'm not quite sure what is meant here, but I think it's about this experience when everything collapses into this nothingness, and there's no knowledge, there's nothing, no awakening, like this total kind of disillusionment in many ways, or seeing that there was never even disillusionment. It can appear initially almost a bit nihilistic, even it's not, because it's beyond that. But this total hopelessness, I guess, it can almost feel like a bit like we are stuck there for a moment before we discover this total dynamic functioning, this self-liberation, this natural release. So when kind of time disappears, time is nowhere to be found, causality is nowhere to be found, linearity is nowhere to be found. It can initially just be super disorienting, and we are kind of consumed by this doubt. Okay, so what he says next is, only when substantialism is wholly released does emptiness and efficacy shine as one seamless taste, radiant conventionality. So I like this passage a lot. And yeah, sometimes it's called automatic functioning or automatic emptiness. So though that's kind of the next unfolding from here. is this discovery of the dynamic nature of this presence, which is now seen to be utterly empty, beyond existence and non-existence, like both and neither. And here, like all the pointers, obviously, they start to sound quite ridiculous. Like I was saying in my previous video, like just relax. And then someone was saying in the comments, but who is there to relax? So this suggestion to relax is not given for any kind of self, is not given for anyone who could be doing this or that. It is a pointer towards, again, very paradoxical release that can occur. I'm going to give a metaphor for it. So imagine that there is a pile of hay that is super tightly bound together. This kind of square pile of hay. Okay? And imagine now that someone would come with scissors and cut that bond. And what happens then is that pile of hay, it just relaxes, releases. So what happens there is we can't really explain it. So it's not like the self disappears because it was never there. It's the same pile of hay, just in a state of natural relaxation and openness, or the same mind in a state of natural relaxation and openness. So apparently nothing happens. Yet there is a fundamental difference to that state where there is this apparent bondage that keeps the mind tightly together. So in that sense, in my opinion, it's ridiculous to say that awakening or non-dual realization is just this non-event, that nothing happens and there's no awakening, and like it's sometimes discussed, because experientially it's a difference between day and night, whether there is this release where nothing anymore holds the mind together, or this apparent bondage. And what's interesting about it is that when this release occurs and nothing is holding you together, nothing is holding the mind together, yet it stays together. Even nothing contains it, nothing holds it. It doesn't just chaotically collapse into some sort of quantum mess. No, its very intelligence is very patterned. There's an order to it, the way it functions. So this is just a metaphor for speaking about something that is very hard to speak about, and that perhaps can only be spoken through poetry or through paradox. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this presentation of the stages that I was doing here, and I hope it gave some perspective. And like my advice is always to hold these type of views very lightly. Like don't hold them too tight, any kind of view. Like this is just one way of talking about it that is based on my experience and based on other similar accounts of this type of sequence of insights that seems to precede the realization of non-duality. But yeah, I really appreciated the discussion and comments in connection with the previous video, and it gave me inspiration and ideas for this video. So thank you guys for participating in the channel. Yeah, and enjoy the journey, enjoy the discovery. Like, it's, in my opinion, this is the coolest thing that there is. It's I wouldn't change this to anything in the world, even though it makes no sense whatsoever. I'm happy to share this with you guys.